Metamorphosis, Daniel chapter 8. I've been, at first I was not looking forward to teaching this one because I thought it would be like the most boring chapter. But as I got into it, there is some really cool stuff in here. And so I'm excited about today. I'm glad you guys showed up. I mentioned before that chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel were all written in the Aramaic language. And they also all deal with the Gentiles. The Aramaic language was the Gentile language. That means it was the language of the world. And so all those chapters actually they focused on not Jewish things, but they focused on Gentile things. Now we get into chapter 8, and the language switches back to Hebrew. And also the focus switches back to the Hebrews, the Jews. And so that's probably a large part of why there's the language change there. So anyway, we're going to focus back on the Jewish people, but this will have stuff that affects the whole world. I saw that some people, as they're teaching through the book of Daniel, a lot of people will skip chapter 8. And I guess I can think of a few reasons why. Probably because a lot of the prophecies that are in chapter 8, they've all been fulfilled already. And so they're not future prophecies. So a lot of people actually skip over these things. I didn't want to skip anything, so I was going to do it anyway. But as I got into it, there's just some pretty cool stories that you guys might not have even heard before. So we'll get into that today. Also, Daniel chapter 8, before we get started, it's one of the most attacked chapters of Daniel. Because Daniel chapter 8 is so specific that people they cannot believe, if they don't want to believe the Bible is true, if they don't want to believe that God is real and that God can give future events and prophecy, people just do not want to believe about how accurate that the Bible can be. But Daniel chapter 8 is very specific and totally accurate in the things that it predicts. So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about today. So you should have your Bible. Go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 8, and we'll start going through this verse by verse. And Daniel 8, it's a lot like last week. The first half of the chapter is a prophecy, and the second half of the chapter is an explanation of the prophecy. So what I'm going to do, as we're reading the prophecy, I'm just going to explain it as we're going through it. So we're going to spend a whole lot of time on the first half, and almost the whole time we're going to spend on the first half. And then once we get to the explanation, we can kind of just fly through it, because by then we should understand it already. But so it'll go slow here at the beginning. So verse 1, Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, and it says, In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. And so this is, this is the king right now, is Belshazzar. Daniel's living in which empire right now? You guys know? Bab what? Baby? Huh? Baby, oh. It's, Babylon. He's living in the Babylonian Empire. Before, the king that we were always focusing on was Nebuchadnezzar. And then a few kings after Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar is the king. And so Daniel's writing this while Belshazzar is the king. Belshazzar is the last king of Babylon. And so he's actually, next week, we're going to be, since we're going through this in chronological order, we're going to hop back to Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to talk about Belshazzar. And so he'll have his own story coming up next. But right now, this is just the time. It's at the time of Belshazzar, and Daniel's going to have another vision. At the time of this, since we can go through history and look, if this is the third year of King Belshazzar of his reign, Daniel is probably like 65 or 70 years old. So he's getting up there now. He's not, do you guys ever, when they talk about like Daniel in the lion's den, a lot of times he's portrayed as like a young man. Have you guys ever noticed that before? Or sometimes even a kid, and they'll talk like Daniel's a kid. He wasn't a kid. He's already 70 years old here, and we haven't even got to the lion's den story. So he's an old man by the time that rolls around. Anyway, he's about 65 or 70. Verse 2, Daniel writes, I saw in the vision, and so it happened, while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Now, before, when he would have these prophetic visions, they were in his sleep, like he was dreaming. On this one, he's at an actual place and he's awake. And so he's at this place called Elam, and he has this vision, he says, while he's standing by the river. Elam is where today it would be called Iran. And so you guys hear about Iran. Iran's been in the news a lot lately, actually. Okay, so he's in this place called Shushan in the Bible. Today we would call it Susa. It's still a city in Iran. And so Iran, it's called Elam here. It's also called Persia in the Bible. And as we know, Persia is going to be the next place, that the next kingdom that rules the world after Babylon. Persia is going to overthrow Babylon and be the next world empire. And Persia's capital is going to be Elam. So he's standing in Elam, and he's going to have a vision about Persia. And so that's why I think that's why he's having this dream or vision or whatever there. Now, I think that some people think, well, maybe he was just transported by God supernaturally over to Elam to have this vision. Other people don't. I think he was just actually there. I think that he went to Elam a lot. And part of the reason I think that is because that's where he was buried. You can actually go, if you're in Susa in Iran, you can go to, this used to be called Elam, but that's Daniel's tomb right there. That's where his tomb is, that he was buried. It's that building with the big cone. That's the tomb of Daniel right there. That's just more of the city back behind. But that's where Daniel is buried. Now, I don't know how he died. I don't think we really know for sure how Daniel died. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Why is it in column?
I don't know. I mean, it's Muslim territory. They build a lot of stuff in shapes like that. So, but that is the tomb of Daniel, so people can actually go there. Now, I don't know why Daniel was buried in Elam. I'm assuming he just spent a lot of time there. So anyway, so I think he's actually at Elam, and he's having this vision. We can't see the river that they're talking about here, this river called, what was it called? The River Ulai. We can't see it in that picture, but I guess it's a picture there. So this is what happens in the vision. Verse 3, Daniel says, "Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last." So he sees a ram with 2 horns. And so far as we've been going through Daniel, what do the animals represent in apocalyptic literature? What do they represent? Empires, yes. The animals just typically have always represented empires. And so this is an animal, it's a ram, and it's got 2 horns. And what have horns been representing?
Leaders.
Well, there was one that represented the Antichrist, but leaders, yeah. The horns represent leaders or rulers or kings, whatever you want to call them. I mean, if it was America, I guess it'd be the president. It's just a leader of that nation. And so this was a ram, and it had 2 leaders because it had 2 horns. So can you guys guess which which nation this animal is representing? Based on what we've already studied about those world empires. In the statue, this one is represented by 2 arms. It's not, I'll go ahead and tell you, the ram with 2 horns is the Medo-Persian Empire. And so we've talked about this one. This is a vision kind of focused a lot on them, and another one. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this one specifically today. But the ram with 2 horns is the Medo-Persian Empire. That's because as Persia was wanting to conquer the world and be the next world empire, when they got to Media, Media was so big, they didn't just conquer Media and rename it. They just kind of joined forces. So then Persia became the Medo-Persian Empire. However, one of the horns is a lot bigger, and that's because the Persians were just a lot bigger than the Medes. And so they carried more weight, and we can just call them the Persians. I'm okay with that. I mean, we don't have to say Medo-Persian all the time. Most people, history teachers, they'll just say the Persian Empire. But that's why. So the bigger horn, that was King Darius. He comes up in a story later too. He's the king of the Persians. The smaller horn is the king of the Medes. His name was Astyages. I'm not sure how to say it, but he's the king of the Medes. So they had 2 leaders. Anyway, that's what the ram represents. Okay, so in verse 4, Daniel writes, "I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him. Nor was there any who could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." So it said that this Persian Empire, he was expanding westward and northward and southward, and not eastward, because he was coming from the east. And I'll show you a picture here of the kind of the territory. It says here that no one could deliver from his hand. He was just conquering stuff. This is the Babylonian Empire. So this is what we've been reading about so far. You can kind of get a sense of the general size of the Babylonian Empire. Okay, when the Persian Empire comes in, they conquer all that. So you can see they've expanded the territory. Here it was before, and see how much bigger the blue area gets. That's after. That's all that the Persians conquered. So they already had this out here, and they expanded northward, westward, and southward, and expanded their empire. Verse 5, Daniel says, "And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes." So this is going to be the next empire to come along after Persia. Can you guys remember who that was by any chance? Greece. There we go. This is the Grecian Empire, and so that's what the goat is. And you can write that one down. I know, it does. And there's so many weird pictures. You know, I Googled all these pictures of rams. Like, I would Google Daniel 8 ram, Daniel 8 ram vision, prophecy, all this kind of stuff. Every picture of the ram, both horns were the same size. And I'm like, guys, I need one with a horn bigger than the other. Because that's what it actually says specifically in the Bible, that one horn was bigger. But anyway, it was kind of hard. They just put pictures of regular rams. And then that's a goat right there, I guess. That's not how I would draw a goat, but whatever, I can't draw. So he's got the one big horn there.
It looks like a unicorn goat.
Yeah, it does look like an epic goat. Then I wish I could draw a goat that well, but I would probably not draw one like that. So anyway, the goat is the Grecian Empire. It said he had a notable horn. And so this leader of the Grecian Empire, his name was Alexander the Great. And so this goat comes along running so fast, it's like he's not even touching the ground. And we've mentioned this a few times before, that's referring to the great speed with which the Grecian Empire was conquering the world. And they did it in from the time Alexander started until he finished, it was about 6 years, which is just incredibly fast if you're trying to conquer the world to do it in 6 years. And so I guess it's faster than all the others. So let's talk about Alexander real quick. Alexander, he was the leader of the Grecian Empire for about 13 years. He started when he was 19 or 20, and he did it until he died at 32 or 33. So it was about 13 years that he was leading the Grecian Empire. He had his first victory as a prince at the age of 18. He led people as an 18-year-old in battle, and he won the battle, and he never lost one after that. In all of his battles trying to conquer the world, he never lost a battle. So he was just like this brilliant military strategist, and he's called Alexander the Great. That's what we call him today. Now, we call him that because of all the, I don't know if we want to call it great that he conquered the world, but, because of just the magnitude of his accomplishments, people will call him the Great. And the reason that's put on there, if you look in history, there were lots of rulers of nations who were called so-and-so the Great. I mean, that just about every single one. It would be like Nebuchadnezzar the Great, Darius the Great. Everyone was called the Great. But then as time went on, some people would be talking about, oh yeah, let me think of someone. Ivan the Great. Ivan the Great, he was such a great leader. But then you'd have these people over there, and they'd be like, Ivan the Great? No, we call him Ivan the Terrible because he destroyed our villages and killed our children and raped our women and stole all of our money. And it would be like, we don't call him Ivan the Great, we call him Ivan the Terrible. And so there was always these conflicts about what to call people because some people would think someone was great, but for everyone who was great, there were others who would be like, we call him so-and-so the Terrible because he was a menace to us. And so people couldn't really settle on what to call each other, so they kind of just dropped all of the great things from people's names, and they would just call them. So Nebuchadnezzar is not called Nebuchadnezzar the Great today. We just call him, like the one that we talk about, he's Nebuchadnezzar the Second, if you were to look in a history book. Alexander the Great, though, that one stuck, because when you just look at everything he did and how successful he was and never losing a battle, that just kind of stuck on there. He's Alexander the Great, and that's just, I guess that's not going to change. So he chased the king of Persia, who was what we would call today Darius III. He chased the king of Persia around that area just for a long time. Darius was just always on the run, and Alexander the Great, growing up, he just hated the Persians, and he wanted to wipe them out. And so he was just chasing Darius all around. Finally, what ended up happening, I guess one of Darius's generals, I guess he gets tired of being chased. So this general named Bessus, he just kills Darius. And Alexander the Great hears about it, and he wanted to be the one to kill Darius. And so Alexander, then he just hunted down this Bessus guy and killed him. He just really wanted to kill. And I think, I even read one time too that when at the age of like 30 or 32, he just kind of went into a depression because he would just cry at night because he would say there's no worlds left to conquer. He had conquered everything. And he felt like there was nothing left to do because he had fulfilled everything he wanted to do. He was a great conqueror, but he was not a great builder. He was not very good at running an empire. He was good at destroying someone else's empire and conquering it. He wasn't so good at managing one on his own. And just to give you guys an example of that, as he was going through all this area and conquering, he destroyed about 70 cities and renamed them after himself because he had a big ego. So he renamed about 70 cities Alexandria. And so that's still, some of them are still called that to this day. But they had like 70 Alexandrias just floating around in there. I mean, think about just how hard that would be to run an empire. And it would be like, go to Alexandria. Well, which Alexandria? I mean, it's kind of like you didn't think about it very much. So they changed a lot of that. And one more interesting thing I learned about him, he was embalmed in honey. Like they smothered his body in honey after he died as a way to preserve his body. And so they did that for a few years, and people would go see his body, I guess, laying there in the honey. And people would just be like, he looks like just as fresh, as if he died yesterday, or looks like he's still alive. That's what I guess honey keeps you from, I guess it's a preservative even for bodies, and apparently it can. They took his body to Egypt to preserve it, and I guess the Egyptians, they're known for their preservation of bodies. So I'm sure that has something to do with mummies too. Anyway, so the Egyptians had this idea to put him in honey, and people would see him and say, hey, he looks great. But eventually, like one of Alexander's generals, they were transporting Alexander's body to one place, and the general was going there, and they crossed paths, and the general's like, this is stupid. And so he went and just built a tomb and put the body in the tomb. So the body's gone now. I guess they know where the tomb is, but the body's gone now. So anyway, that's some stuff about Alexander. I got a little bit more about him, but just, when you take time, and if you can learn about Alexander the Great, he did have just a lot of interesting things about him. So Daniel chapter 8, in verses 6 and 7, it says, then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing by the river. He who came to the ram, that's the goat. The goat's coming after the ram, because as you know, Alexander's going to conquer Persia. So then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power, because Alexander hated the Persians. He grew up hating them. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. So, this goat was more powerful than the ram. And Alexander the Great's not just mentioned here in the Bible. He's also alluded to in this passage in Zechariah. You don't have to write all these names down, but there's this passage in Zechariah where it's listing like judgment coming to all of these cities, God's judgment coming to these cities. And I'll just read, it's from Zechariah chapter 9. You don't have to write these down, I'm just going to mention some of them. The word of the Lord is against Hadrach and will rest upon Damascus. To the Lord belong the cities of Aram, even as all the tribes of Israel. Hamath also, which borders thereon, Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. Tyre has built herself a rampart, heaped up with silver like dust and gold like the mud of the streets. But lo, the Lord will strip her of her possessions and hurl her wealth into the sea, and she shall be devoured by fire. Ashkelon shall see it and be afraid. Gaza too shall writhe in anguish. Ekron also, because its hopes are confounded. And so there's this list in Zechariah chapter 9, which was written right after Daniel, not very long after Daniel. And people would say, well, what's the deal with all these cities having judgment coming on them? Like, why is that? Like I try to tell you guys, there's always a reason to the order God puts things in. And so when you look at these cities, you're like, well, okay, all this judgment to these cities, what's significant about the order of them? Well, this is the trail that Alexander the Great was going along as he was conquering when he was coming through that area. It was just like ding, 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 just like Zechariah chapter 9. Those are all the cities that Alexander the Great was hitting. And so as he was going along, he gets to this one here, Tyre, somewhere right around Tyre. That's whenever he decides, I'm going to head down to Jerusalem, and I'm going to wipe out that city. And it's not that he disliked Jews. It was just because Jerusalem was under control of Persia at this time. It was in Persia's territory. And so to Alexander, he's just like, well, I'm going to go wipe out Jerusalem because it's one of the Persian cities and I hate the Persians. So it wasn't that he really hated Jews. He just wanted to go wipe out Jerusalem. So he's making his way down there. And Josephus, he's a Jewish historian, he wrote about this story. So Alexander the Great's coming on, making his way down to Jerusalem, and the Jews are getting very nervous down there. And they're like, oh crap, he's going to come. We have no chance against this guy. He's just, he's conquering everything else that he comes up against. And so as they get into like a little prayer meeting, and the priests are going around and they're praying. But this one priest, I think his name Jaddua. Jaddua is the high priest at this time. And so Jaddua hears from God, and God tells Jaddua, I want you all to put on your priestly clothes and go out to meet him. He's telling this to the Jews. He says, before Alexander gets here, I want you guys to put on your priestly robes and go out and meet him. And they're thinking, well, what's the point of this? He's just going to kill us out there instead of killing us in our city. But they go ahead and do it. So Jaddua and a couple other of the priests go out, and they go to meet, and Alexander's coming with his army. So Alexander's coming, and he stops his whole army from approaching, and he gets off his horse, and he goes up to these Jews by himself. Like he didn't take anybody with him. He said, all of you stay back, and I'm going to go up here by myself. So he went up and talked to him, and some even say that he bowed down before these Jews. And then he came back to his generals, and he says, we're not going to touch the city of Jerusalem. And they're like, well, why? Why did you just go out there and just go talk to them by yourself? That was dangerous. They could have killed you. They could have ambushed you or something. Why would you do that? Well, Alexander tells them, before I started my conquest, I had a dream. And there was a man wearing these robes that these people were wearing. He said there was a man wearing these robes, that what we would call the high priest robe. And he says, the man told me to go attack Persia and wipe them out. So he says he's not touching these people because he knows they're God's people. He thinks that, God, which I think is probably what happened. God came to Alexander the Great in a vision and told him that stuff. So Alexander the Great's like, so I'm not going to touch this city. So he went around Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was fine. And so anyway, it's kind of spooky, but really interesting. And one more thing. So he goes out to meet these Jews, and while he's meeting the Jews out there, they pull out the book of Daniel, and they read those verses that we were just reading a second ago. And it was these verses that are about Alexander the Great. And they show him in the book of Daniel these prophecies, where it says, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth, and he had a noble horn between his eyes. Then he said to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing by the river, ran at him with furious power, and I saw him confronting the ram, and he was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. And so they showed him that, and Alexander the Great knew that that was a prophecy about him. He saw that with his own eyes, and he believed it from the Bible. So that would think to be him. And he was actually right too. Just think to be Alexander the Great, and you're reading the Bible, and it's talking about you specifically. And he knew that. What Josephus wrote, I don't know if I put it up here. Yeah. Josephus wrote, and when the book of Daniel was shewed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude for the present. So he looked at the Bible, and he knew it was about him, and he wasn't even a believer. That's just pretty cool, isn't it? And so he wasn't even a believer in God, but he believed Bible prophecy, and so he took that as a good sign that he was going to win in his battle, and he just went on, and he did win. Okay, we'll go back to Daniel, verse 8. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in the place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And it's true, just as Alexander the Great was at his strongest, he died. And so people aren't sure how he died. Some think he may have got an STD, or maybe he just got sick, or he got drunk. People aren't really for sure what his cause of death was. But he died a young man, 32 or 33 years old. And so the prophecy said 4 notable horns came up in his place. And again, that is absolutely true. This is why people don't want to believe Daniel 8 was written in advance, because they don't want to believe prophecy. But Even some Christians that don't even believe that Daniel 8 was written in advance, I'm like, come on, if you believe that God can do anything, he can tell the future. But anyway, so 4 horns came up in his place, and after Alexander the Great died, his empire was divided up into 4 parts. And so here's a map. You can't really see it that close. It's not even in English, but it's the best one I could find. And so these are the 4 parts that his empire was divided up into. This green section, the orange section, the yellow section, and down here is a blue section. And those represent the 4 people he left his empire to. Their names were Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. I don't know how to say these names, but sorry, I'm doing my best. Cassander, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy. And those are the 4 horns that grew up on the goat. And so anyway, that's that was the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire. Pretty much for the rest of the time the Greek Empire existed, it was in 4 different sections. And so that's how it existed for hundreds of years until the Romans came along and conquered it. While Greece was ruling the world, up until just a little bit before Jesus Christ was born, the Greeks ruled this section of the world. And so maybe you've heard this word before, Hellenization. The definition of Hellenization, it's a little bit wordy. You can put it in your own words if you want to, but I want you to know what it means. What the Greeks would do is the Greeks thought that they were just the best, and so their way of culture, their way of doing things, their culture, they thought everybody should just do it because it's good enough for the Greeks, and the Greeks are on top, so they thought everyone should be like the Greeks. And so they employed a practice called Hellenization, and it means to try to take away other people's culture and make them Greek. Change people from whatever they are before and Greekify them. And so the wordy definition here, the spread of Greek culture and the assimilation into Greek culture of non-Greek peoples. Now, you can put that in your own words if you want. I don't care if you memorize this word for word, but I would kind of like you to understand what it means. And so this is the world that Jesus Christ was born into. Even though it was Roman, it had been very, very Hellenized. And so that's why you see so much Greek stuff in the New Testament. By the time Jesus is born and you read about him and the stuff that went on, there's so many Greek references, like a lot of the athletics and stuff that they do. A lot of them speak the Greek language. The whole New Testament is written in Greek. And you have things in the Bible where it says to the Jew first and also to the Greek. It's just because they did Greekify everything really, really well. And then Rome took over, but there was still a lot of the Greek influence, even up to today. There's even Greek, just that influence is still along today. So anyway, so far it's just been following along right with history. Now the vision is about to get kind of weird. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 9, and out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So a little horn is growing up out of this goat which represents Greece. What did the little horn represent last time? The Antichrist, yeah. Last time the little horn represented, it's not the same thing this time. Last time it was the Antichrist. This time it's about a Greek man named Antiochus Epiphanes. That's his name right there. I know you want to call it Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what it looks like. It's actually pronounced Antiochus Epiphanes. Try saying that. Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. And so make a note of that the little horn this time, make a note that this time he's Antiochus Epiphanes, and he is a type of the Antichrist. I'll explain what that means in a second. He's a type of the Antichrist. So when I say that he's a type of the Antichrist, and I put that in quotation marks, this is a word that people who study the Bible, that they'll use to describe certain figures. And I'll give you a complex definition of what a type is. You don't have to write down this definition. This is the nerdy one that I found. A type is a real, exalted happening in history, which was divinely ordained by the omniscient God to be a prophetic picture of future things. That's kind of hard to understand, though, right? So let me give you a simpler definition, and this is kind of what we'll kind of work with. A type is, in Bible study, is a model of something else to come. And so through the Bible, God will often give us types or pictures, things that represent other things in the Bible. And they're just all through the Bible. They're called types. Sometimes you might hear them called shadows, or sometimes you might hear them called patterns, or we could just call them types. But anyway, a type is a model of something else to come. Let me give you like an example from the real world. Here's a picture of the USS Enterprise. It's a boat, an aircraft carrier by the government. Not the Starship Enterprise. This is the USS Enterprise.
They stole it from Star Trek.
I think Star Trek stole it from this one.
No, Star Trek never stole
Okay.
anything.
Okay.
Star Trek is real. Star Trek is...
I know, it's just the future.
I can't believe.
Transmissions from the future. Okay, here's the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier. This is a model of the USS Enterprise.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can study the model. We can study the model of the USS Enterprise and know a lot of things about the USS Enterprise. Like we can figure out a lot of stuff, like even though it's just a model, it can tell us a lot of details about the real thing. However, the model is not the real thing, so it's going to fall short in some ways. There's going to be some things I can learn from the model and some things that I can't. That's how a type works in the Bible. A type is a model that's showing us something about something else in the future. Or it might be a shadow. I'll explain the shadow in a second. Let me just give you an example of a type, because this is how Jews understand prophecy. The way that we think of prophecy, we think someone gives a prophecy and then the prophecy is fulfilled. Like A, prophecy is given, B, prophecy is fulfilled. Now I understand prophecy. That's how we think of things a lot. The Jews believe that too, but there's more to it for them. Jews also see prophecy as patterns. So they look at how things happen in the Bible, and they think those same patterns will just repeat again and again in the future. They just think that things don't really change, and the same kind of circles or patterns are just repeated. And so when they look into the Bible, they're looking for patterns that will be replicated in the future. So one of them here, maybe this is one of the most obvious ones in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 22, God tells Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son. He says, I want you to take your son Isaac up on a hill and sacrifice him. Now, I say that's one of the most obvious because we all know that story, that Abraham is obedient, and he's like, God, I don't know why you'd want me to sacrifice your son, especially all the times you tell us not to sacrifice our kids, but since you told me, I'm going to obey you. So Abraham goes up the mountain, and they're up on the mountain, and Abraham's about to kill his son, and then God says, hold up, I was just testing you. I wanted to make sure that you were going to listen and do whatever I said. And so it was a test for Abraham. Abraham passed the test, and Isaac didn't have to die. But whenever you read this story and you look at the details, there's a little bit more to it than that. Like in verse 2, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt sacrifice upon one of the mountains, which I shall tell you. Now God tells him, take your son, your only son. But it wasn't his only son. Abraham had other sons. At the time of Isaac, he already had another one named, you know what? Ishmael.
Yeah.
So he already had Ishmael. So Isaac's not even his only son. But God tells him, I want you to take your only son whom you love. Now, why is God telling him your only son when God knows just as well as we do that Abraham has more than one son? No, it's not because he loved Ishmael too. He was sad when Ishmael left. But the reason is God's trying to draw our attention to what he's doing here. So Isaac, now you getting it? Isaac is a type of Jesus because Jesus is God's only begotten son. And so God says, I want you to take your son whom you love and offer him as a sacrifice. Isaac is a type of Jesus because God was going to take his only son whom God loved, and God was going to offer Jesus as a sacrifice. And so that's how a type works, as you find these parallels. And it even goes deeper than that. Like a few other things. From the time that God told Abraham to kill Isaac until they went up on Mount Moriah, it was 3 days. The Bible says 3 days passed. From the time that God gave the command to kill Isaac until they went up there to do it, it was 3 days. And so what happened else 3 days in the Bible? Jesus died, and 3 days later he rose again. Here's another good one. So Isaac doesn't die in the sacrifice, but in the Bible, he's not mentioned by name again in the Bible until the chapter where he meets his wife. After the sacrifice where he doesn't actually die, Isaac is not mentioned by name again. He disappears. And he's not mentioned until he meets his wife later on in the book of Genesis. Now, the parallel with us is that, so Jesus rose from the dead after his sacrifice. So Jesus disappeared. He went up to heaven. And Jesus is not going to be heard from again until he's reunited with his bride, which is us. That's when Jesus pops back on the scene. And so there's all these connections. And one more, Mount Moriah is the exact same place where Jesus himself was crucified. That's the spot the Romans picked. And they went up on Mount Moriah, which by then was called Calvary. And that's where Jesus was crucified. And so that's how types work. It's a pattern. And that's what Jews look for. They want to see patterns replicated. And so that's a type. Now let's get back to Antiochus Epiphanes. So I said Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of the Antichrist. He represents the Antichrist. The things that Antiochus Epiphanes does, God is showing us that so that we'll look at him, and that will tell us stuff about the Antichrist later. So let's go back over here and look at this map again. Antiochus Epiphanes right here. He's the king out of this, what's called the Seleucid Empire. And what he actually did was, the King Seleucus died, and he had a son who was just like a baby. And so Antiochus Epiphanes comes in, and he says, well, he's like a cousin of the royal family. And he says, well, listen, I'll just rule as king for a while. And when the baby grows up, I'll turn the ownership of the kingdom over to him. I'll just be a temporary king and just rule this region for a little while. But I'm going to turn it over when the kid's old enough. So he's acting like he's doing a nice thing. However, after he's been king for a few years, I don't know if he really had good intentions from the start. I don't think so. But he decides he wants to keep being king. So he has the kid killed so that there is no more heir. And then he can just keep on being king. So that's what happened to him. So he ruled this yellow region. And then he decided he wanted to rule all the regions. And so he started picking a war with the Ptolemaic king down here. And so he marched his way down. And he picked a fight down there. And he won. And he said, well, I'm going to let you keep ruling down here. But you're going to be my puppet. And I'm going to go back up and conquer the rest of these places. So he's going back up, and here, let's see what that verse says again. This little horn, who's Antiochus Epiphanes, he grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And that glorious land is Israel. So he's on his way back up, and he stops by Israel. And at that time, the high priest in Israel, remember this is like years after Jaddua. It's a different one. His name's Amias, something like that. I'm just going to put, this is Antiochus Epiphanes. Put a frowny face on him and angry eyes. Okay, so he makes his way back up to Jerusalem. The high priest is named like Amias, but there's another priest in Israel, and he's a bad dude. And I'm not kidding when I tell you this. His name is Jason. Jason the priest. So I'm just gonna... Sunglasses and a leather jacket. Okay. Now, for real, there was another priest named Jason. And so, and I'll just draw, I can't remember how to spell his name. I didn't put it in my notes, but I think it's Onias. Yeah. I'm just going to put an old guy with gray hair and a beard. So he's the high priest. Jason's just a priest. Jason's not a good guy. He gives a bunch of money to Antiochus Epiphanes and says, hey, can you make me the high priest? I'm going to give you all this money. And Antiochus Epiphanes says, sure, you can help me control Jerusalem. So he has Onias here killed. And Jason's the high priest now. And so Jason rules over Jerusalem for a while because he's given this money to Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, as time goes on, Jason, I still just find it funny that there's a high priest in the Bible. Well, he's not mentioned by name in the Bible, named Jason, in history. That just cracks me up. Yeah. So yeah, I know. We have Onias, Antiochus Epiphanes, and Jason. So anyway, Jason's the high priest. Well, he goes and starts another city. And so he leaves Jerusalem, and he just wants to found a new one. And Antiochus lets him, but he says, you have to name the city after me. And so the city is named, you knew it. Good job, Hannah. The city is named Antioch. Not really anything to say about it, except one just interesting little tidbit is that later on in the book of Acts, Antioch is the name of the city where people were first called Christians. People weren't called Christians until they started a church in Antioch. And the Romans said, we got to call you guys something. Because before then, they were just called believers. And they didn't call it Christianity. They just called it the way. And so people, that wasn't specific enough for people. So they said, well, when they were at Antioch, the Romans said, okay, we're going to call you guys Christians because you follow a guy named Christ. And so that's where Christian came from. So the Bible says Antioch is the first place they were called Christians. That's just like a little interesting tidbit. It was started, though, by Jason. Okay, so anyway, Antiochus just keeps on ruling and going along with life. Jason says, hey, I need to send Antiochus some more money so he'll keep letting me be the high priest. Like, I guess that's just what they did back then. They would just send money to people, like, to get favors and stuff. That was just what he expected to do. So he says, so he got another priest, and this priest was named Menelaus. So how do I want to draw him? He's a double-crosser guy. So, two guns. Okay. A cowboy hat? Okay. So this guy's a cowboy. So Menelaus, he gives the money to Menelaus and says, take this to Antiochus Epiphanes so that he'll just keep liking me and showing me favor. Well, Menelaus does that, but when he gets to Antiochus Epiphanes, he says, hey, if I give you this money, will you make me the high priest? So anyway, so then he becomes the high priest, and Jason loses his position. So then Jason gets mad.
Wait,
so
didn't it kill Jason like they did?
he didn't just kill, because I guess Jason's over here at Antioch still, so I guess he was safe in his own city. Well, then so Jason says, well, I want to come back from Antioch over to Jerusalem and take my place back. So he goes back, and they start a fight out there in Jerusalem. Well, then Antiochus hears about it, and he's like, whoa, this has gotten way out of hand. Like, this is more than I wanted to deal with. So Antiochus Epiphanes said, just to put an end to all this, we're just going to kill all the Jews. That's his plan. Just to get rid of all this civil unrest. I guess he's probably thinking, I'm trying to, rule the world here, and these Jews are just having a little fight between themselves, so we're just going to kill them all.
Wait,
So-
not just kill the two leaders.
Yeah, not just kill the two who are starting it.
Kill everyone.
So it would make sense, I guess, but that's not what he so anyway, Antiochus starts killing Jews. He marches his soldiers in, and in one day, he slaughtered 40,000 Jews in Jerusalem. And he imprisoned 40,000 more. And 80,000 more of them were just scattered, and they were just kind of like, they were called lost. I mean, I guess they just went somewhere else to live. They ran away. 40,000 died in a day, 40,000 put into slavery, and 80,000 just abandoned Jerusalem. And I'm not sure who's left in Jerusalem. But anyway, so he tried to wipe out the Jews, and he even said that if you find a baby and the baby has been circumcised, throw him off of a building, throw him off of the walls, because we just don't want any more Jews. All they're doing is causing problems. And so and we see from history, too, there's lots of men in history who've tried to wipe out the Jews. That's exactly what I was about to say. Hitler is also like a type of the Antichrist, because he is a model. He's showing what the Antichrist is going to do. Hitler wiped out 1/3 of all the Jews. And the Antichrist, the Bible says, is going to kill 2/3 of all the Jews. Yeah, he'll do twice as... Well, now there's not even as many. There were 18 million, and Hitler killed 6 million. So that brought it down to 12 million. And then today there's about 14 million. So if 2/3 of them were to get wiped out, that'd be like 7 or 8 million, I guess, 9 million, something like that. So anyway, those are types of the Antichrist. Nebuchadnezzar is a type of the Antichrist. Even though he wasn't like probably as bad as Antiochus Epiphanes or Hitler, but he built a statue of himself to make people worship it. Revelation says the Antichrist is going to build a statue of himself to make people worship it. So these people are types of the Antichrist. So do you guys kind of see how types work? Types can also be like a shadow. That's what some people call them, shadows. Because, I mean, think if you see, if you see the shadow of a person, like let's say that you didn't see his face or anything, you just saw a shadow, an outline of Menelaus here. Well, you wouldn't really know what Menelaus looked like necessarily, but you would be able to tell some features about him. Like you could see he's holding guns and has a cowboy hat, so he's probably like a cowboy, right? You can look at a shadow and figure out some details. And that's what types do. They tell us details about a person. They're pointing to something yet in the future. So do you guys see how types work? Okay, we're pretty close to being done. Okay, so the verses here about, Daniel chapter 8. Like I said, we spent a lot of time on the early verses, but we can go through these faster. So verses 10, 11, and 12, it's talking about this horn who is Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a type of the Antichrist. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast some of them, the host, and threw some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. That's talking about the Jews. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth to the ground, and he did all this and prospered. And so that's also things we know about Antiochus Epiphanes from history. He halted all the Jewish religious practices. He said, no more sacrifices of animals, none of that. He said that pigs had to be sacrificed instead of the animals the Jews would sacrifice. And you guys know Jews do not like pigs. They're very anti-pigs. So he would say you can only sacrifice pigs for your sacrifices, no more animals. And so he would forbid it. He would forbid circumcision. He'd forbid any of the religious practices that the Jews did, and he was trying to wipe them out. In verses 13 and 14, Daniel says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, 'How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?' And he said to me, 'For 2,300 days, and then the sanctuary shall be cleansed.'" So he said this little horn, the Antiochus Epiphanes, he would be allowed to rule for 2,300 days, which from history we can see that too. It's a period of a little bit over 7 years, and that's about how long Antiochus Epiphanes was ruling. And so he died in the year 164 or 163 BC, something like that. And so from the time he had entered Jerusalem until the day he died, that was 2,300 days. And so this vision was so specific. That's why people don't want to believe Daniel. They don't want to believe that it was written in advance. Because then you have to admit that God knows what he's doing, that God's real, and that he can write this stuff down, and he knows the end from the beginning. And so that's the prophecy. Now, we've explained the prophecy as we were going through it. So I don't know, we're not going to have to do much explanation as we're going through it. Antiochus Epiphanes is going to come up again in a later chapter, and so there's more to his story, but we'll go ahead and stop there about him. So Daniel's going to get this interpretation of it, and I'm going to read a chunk of verses here of the interpretation, starting at verse 15. "And then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.' So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end.' Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, 'Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be.'" So this angel is going to explain things to Daniel. His name is Gabriel. This is the first time in the Bible that an angel is given a name. Unless you count Satan, because he was a bad angel, this is the first time a good angel is given a name. So that's Gabriel. Gabriel is also the same angel who went to John the Baptist's mother and to Jesus' mother to tell them that they were going to have babies. He's the same angel who sent that message. And that's what Gabriel's always doing. He's always bringing a message whenever he shows up. Verse 20. "The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power." And so we've covered that already. Now the angel Gabriel is I'm going to give you one more slide to look at today. It's the last one. But the angel Gabriel is going to explain stuff about Antiochus Epiphanes, but everything that he's saying is also about the Antichrist. It's what's called double fulfillment. And so this is one more thing in Bible study. Double fulfillment in Bible prophecy It's whenever someone uses the same words to describe two different things, or people, or events. One is in the near future, and one is in the distant future. But that's how double fulfillment works. It's the same words describing two different people, things, or events. Okay, so I'm going to read the verses 23, 24, and 25. So these things are about Antiochus Epiphanes, but they could also be things that describe the Antichrist. And that's because the Antiochus is standing in as a model for us. And so it says in verse 23, "And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes." Now, just for the sake of time, we won't cover specifically what every single line of that is saying. But I will say when it says that he understands sinister schemes, that just means he's a very clever man. He's a very intelligent man, but it's implying that he uses his intelligence for bad stuff. And that's something that I hate personally. Like when I see someone with a God-given gift for intelligence or creativity, and then they go and they'll use it to like promote sin. I just hate that because I'm like, man, you're so creative, but you have to use it to do bad stuff with it. It makes me sad. Verse 24, "His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully. He shall prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people." So it says he'll be mighty, but not by his own power. And like Antiochus, he was not supposed to be the king. It was supposed to be this kid. But Antiochus forced his way in, and then he killed the kid so he could be king. So he's mighty, but it's not by his own right to be mighty. And also the Antichrist will be moved into position by Satan. They'll both prosper and thrive, and they'll both try to destroy the holy people. They'll try to wipe out the Jews. And then verse 25, "Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means." Now, who is he rising against if he rises against the prince of princes? Jesus, yeah. Jesus, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, he's called here the Prince of Princes. How could Antiochus Epiphanes rise against Jesus if Antiochus didn't even know about Jesus? Some people would say, well, hold up, this can't be about Antiochus because he didn't rise. This must be just talking about the Antichrist. Well, both of them will rise up against Jesus. See, God's plan for the Jewish people, from the very beginning, he said, I'm going to bring the Messiah out of the Jewish people. And so all along, Satan's always trying to wipe out the Jews. All through history. Before when he was doing it, Satan knew if he could wipe out the Jews, then God would be wrong and there couldn't be a Messiah come out of the Jews. So that's always been Satan's plan. Wipe out the Jews, stop the Messiah. But he failed. Jesus came anyway. But God still has plans for the Jews. And so Satan still tries to kill them through men like Hitler and someday in the Antichrist so he can prove God wrong. So he can say, see, God, you couldn't protect him. That's what Satan's always trying to do with the Jewish people. And so that's how Antiochus rose against Jesus himself by trying to wipe out the Jews before Jesus could be born. And the Antichrist will try to rise against Jesus also. And it says, but he shall be broken without human means. Because Antiochus Epiphanes, he was killed by a disease. He just got sick and died. It was I don't know what kind of disease it was, but I guess it was pretty disgusting, whatever he got. So he died in a very miserable way. And the Antichrist, he'll be beaten by Jesus himself when that rock strikes the statue. And he comes tumbling down. Okay, last two verses of the chapter, 26 and 27. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business, and I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. Isn't it amazing that Daniel couldn't understand the vision, but we can, because we have the benefit of looking back in history and seeing how it all works. The verse before we leave today, I'm going to give you guys verse cards for... Last week we talked about the times of the Gentiles, and that it's those times, the times of the Gentiles are when Jerusalem is under Gentile control. And so it will be under Gentile control from the time Babylon rolled in up until the Antichrist. It'll be under Gentile control. And so Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so that's an important verse to understand what it means in Bible prophecy. It's also a simple one, so that's what I'm going to give you guys on the cards this week. for the Horn Identity. Did any of you guys like the Horn Identity title? I felt pretty smart about that one, I'll admit. So thank you guys for coming out today. Like I said before, some people skip Daniel 8 because all this stuff has pretty much been fulfilled, except for the Antichrist part being double fulfillment, but all these things happened already, so people don't think it's worth time to study it. But I hope you guys like learning about it. I thought it was pretty interesting, all these stories about Jason and Menelaus and Jaddua and Alexander the Great reading about himself in the Bible. That stuff, I just found that pretty fascinating. So hope you guys did too. Next week, anyone guess where we'll be? Going through chronological order of Daniel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12. So we're through 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8. Next week we'll go back to 5.